By show of hands, who here was not here last night? Just so I can get a sense. Okay, we will do a quick review. You can also watch it later. These are recorded. And so, does anyone remember who was here last night? What was our title for our part one of our part two with trauma? It was Conceal and Seal the Invisible Wounds of Trauma. And we were talking about how basically why don't we talk about trauma? Why should we talk about trauma? Is because we don't talk about it. And we need to. And so we went through these various points of why we don't talk about trauma. We think often it's an issue with the minority of individuals. And we realize, no, that's not the case. It's not the minority, it's the majority. We also realize that many times we don't talk about it because we minimize its effects. It's just an emotional thing. No, it impacts our physical health, it impacts our relationships, our spirituality, every aspect of life. Many times we don't talk about it because it's really complex and confusing, whether for the individual themselves or for those around them. And then also there's an element of shame. When people experience trauma, they themselves are silenced by the perpetrator or they silence themselves. And so many times it's the secret that we have that we don't share. And so we talk about trauma in the words of, invisibility, right? There's these invisible wounds. If I went and I broke my arm, right, there would be a visibility to that wound. But with trauma, many times it's this invisible wound that we carry. And not just that we carry, but we intentionally conceal it and seal it. Right? We store it within ourselves. And so today we're going to be talking about revealing that and healing that. Now, if you think about the trauma recovery or just the word recovery, what does it mean to recover something? Right? What was that? Get back to where you were, or even just in the general terms. So I have a picture here. If you accidentally, put some files or pictures into the trash of your computer, you're going to recover those files. So the definition, the action or process of regaining possession or control of something that was stolen or lost. So I really love that word when it comes to trauma, because we can think about trauma recovery as finding your true self. Many times when we've experienced trauma, we feel like we're not fully ourselves. And so we're finding our true self, how God made you to be, He designed you to be, but it's buried underneath all that pain, all that suffering. You can think about someone who maybe is buried in the sand, right? And they're trying to come out, and it's really difficult, but possible. And so trauma recovery, trying to find our true selves. Now, I'm going to mention a lot of resources tomorrow, including books and other things. But here are a few more audio resources. And the reason why I mention these is because this topic today, I have covered in a 5-part series. Because the process and the journey of healing is very long and very complex. And so I already saw some of the questions about, how to heal and so forth. And I won't have time to answer all of them. And I won't be able to address all of it in this topic today. So this is kind of a disclaimer that for a number of disclaimers, first off, it might be a little overwhelming. And it's okay if you feel overwhelmed. I designed it to some degree in that way because different people need different things. So don't walk away from this thinking that I need to do all of it and today or tomorrow. Take what's needed, right? Take what's needed today, a month from now, so forth. And then some people are at different parts in their journey of healing. So I've tried to be all encompassing and comprehensive. And also because this is recorded, and so you can watch it later and continue on your healing journey. So it can seem like a lot. And I might go through some things quickly, but it's because I know you have the slides and you'll have the recorded information later for you to review on your own. And again, the journey of healing in general is long and can be complex, but especially for trauma. So let's start with the step number 1, reveal. Reveal what's hidden. The first step of receiving healing is awareness. You cannot change what you do not acknowledge. You cannot heal what you do not know is wounded. It seems very simple. And I even looked at one of the questions, and one person asked, like, how do I know if this trauma I've experienced has really affected me, or how severely it's affected me? And so awareness is key. I love this quote. It says, if you want to change the fruits, which if you think about with a tree is what's visible. Many times we mask things, and so we look fine to everyone else. The fruits might look fine, or maybe they're rotten and you pick them out really quickly, but they grow back. If you want to change the fruits, you will first have to change the roots. If you want to change the visible, you must first change the invisible. And remember, with trauma, it's something that we can hide for decades. Like the client I mentioned, Linda, who had hidden her trauma for decades and thought it was okay, but it does come out. So do I need healing? And some of you might already know the answer to that. You might say, yes, that's why I'm here. Some of you might be saying in your heart, well, I'm here for so-and-so. But before you completely conclude that, take a look at yourself, and we'll have some questions of self-assessment. Kneel and ask God to reveal those invisible wounds. Psalm 139 says, search my heart, O God, right? Search it. Know my thoughts, try my thoughts, see if there's any, it says wicked, but even if there's anything in me, God, because we have a tendency to self-deceive. So we might say, I'm okay, but asking God, and there's a humility in this, to say, God, search me. See my insecurities, my struggles, my vulnerabilities, the ugliest parts that we don't want to see, and stop looking at others for a moment and look at yourself. I don't know how many times I've heard someone say, oh, my husband makes me mad, right? Or that person triggered me. And you see this a lot in our wider culture today, a lot of blaming. But if you say that person triggered me, we don't realize that our guns are already loaded with ammo. So they may trigger you, but what's within yourself that's ready to fire? And that's what we need to acknowledge. Like, some people can do some things that are pretty triggering, yes, but we don't realize that we do have the choice and ability to know what ourselves are responsible for in responding to that. So here are some questions, both general, and then I'll ask more specific trauma questions of self-assessment. And I'm using more of a CBT model, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the most evidence-based practice for therapy and for treatment. And it looks at these 3 main components of our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors. Those are the 3 main components that make up who we are. And they're all linked. So if I have a negative thought, I have an unpleasant emotion, and then I'll engage in unhealthy behavior. So here are some questions you can start asking yourself. How's my daily functioning? Day to day, what does it look like maybe at school, work, church, home, my relationships, my energy levels, my sleep? Are there any of those that are not circumstantial? You might say, oh, my sleep is terrible because I have 5 little ones under the age of 6, right? Like, that's a different issue. But maybe you have chronic sleep issues and your children are grown, right? Or there's no circumstances that dictate that your sleep is off, your energy levels, or let's say you have a lot of themes or patterns in your life where you have difficulty with relationships. Sometimes my clients lack awareness, and I say, you know, you're telling me that you have issues with this person, this person, this person, this person. Is there a common denominator here, right? And so looking and being honest with yourself in these different areas. We can break this down into these 3 areas. Look specifically at your habits, your behaviors. What's my diet look like? My exercise, my self-care? Do I engage in any addiction? So tomorrow we'll cover a whole presentation on addictions. Emotions. How is my mood most days? Now, notice most days. If you just went through a circumstance, let's say the loss of a loved one, right? You're going to experience a lot of low and unpleasant emotions. That's very specific to the situation. But most days, am I down most days? Am I anxious, angry, irritable, ashamed? Is my mood generally consistent or unstable, right? Fluctuating a lot. What about the trend of my thoughts? Are they primarily negative? If you notice that you're constantly inwardly criticizing yourself, you stub your toe and you're like, I'm so stupid, and for any little thing, you're just hard on yourself. What's the inward trend of my thoughts? But let's look more specifically at trauma. So that's just a general kind of a self-assessment of how's my mental health. Have I experienced trauma? That's why the first presentation is really helpful to understand what exactly is trauma. Can I think or talk about my trauma or traumas without a strong urge to avoid? That's a very clear sign how much healing I've had. Some people, they are able to talk about their trauma, share about their trauma. We're going to talk about the importance of sharing your story. Some people, any reminder of the trauma, any opportunity to share bits of their story, they run, they hide, and sometimes, right, people don't even know of their story. How do I feel when I think or talk about it? Am I triggered frequently? Are these triggers perhaps related to my traumas? And some triggers are very obvious. Like when I used to work in the VA, I had various veterans who had gone to combat. I had one individual early on in my experience who was a Vietnam vet, and he was very aware of his triggers of anyone of Asian descent, right? He'd see that and immediately he'd be triggered as if he was back in combat. Even children, because back in that time with the Vietnam War, children were used as weapons. And so he knew that very clearly. But some people, they might be triggered in more hidden and disguised ways. It might be, oh, that person makes me so angry. And until we sit with it long enough, they're like, oh, that reminds me of my dad. And I had no idea that I'm here angry at that person, thinking that it's just that situation, but it's because that person has certain characteristics or traits of my father. So am I triggered frequently? What exactly now is the problem? Many times I mentioned this last night, my addictions, anxiety, depression, we fill in the blank. But remember, that's often very symptom focused, but not root focused. And we know that trauma is the root. But even when we think about trauma, some people say, oh, the problem that I have is because I experienced X trauma. But what's really fascinating is that if it was only the trauma, there have been many collective traumas, like 9/11, that happened to many people, but only some people experienced and developed PTSD. So it can't just be the situation. It can't just be the trauma itself. So they did a study where they looked at survivors of 9/11 during the terrorist attack, and they only found 4.7% of the individuals who experienced that trauma to develop PTSD or to maintain the PTSD 7 to 12 months later. We cannot diagnose PTSD within a first month after something traumatic happens. Does anyone know why? Yeah, because it's so traumatic for everyone. It's actually normal to have PTSD symptoms in the first month. Your brain hasn't yet processed it. Now, if in that month you take time to process and understand what happened, you don't go on to develop PTSD. So it was interesting to find only an average of 5% continue. So you wonder, okay, if it's not the trauma itself, and 9/11 was very traumatic in many different ways, then what exactly is it? So these are three main clusters of symptoms for PTSD. You have the arousal component, which is a lot of the emotions, right? This is where you might feel constantly anxious. You might feel constantly hypervigilant, where you're always on guard, watching for danger. So a lot of the emotions go under arousal. as well as things that go along with it, your heart rate being constantly elevated, cortisol, so forth. Then we have what we call intrusions. These are often intrusive thoughts that you have about the trauma. This might be nightmares. This might be also intrusions in the sense of triggers, but unwanted feelings and unwanted thoughts and memories. And then lastly, you have the memory itself. Now, what happens in the first month for many people, and what happens in healthy recovery, is we experience trauma. We all have those three components, but notice what happens. The arousal goes down, right? Our body starts to calm itself. The intrusions start to go down, and what's left? The memory. Notice the memory doesn't go away. You cannot forget what happened, but we can remember it in a healthy way. So the question that we have is, what gets in the way of recovery? Which, from a Christian perspective, God has designed us in a way to naturally heal. He can't prevent the bad things from happening, but all of us will have a healthy recovery if something doesn't get in the way. Does anyone want to guess? You already have your hand up. Go for it. Yes. What we call avoidance. So, remind me of your name? Emily had mentioned substances, which is probably one of the most common forms of avoidance. Yes. Yeah. Always fear, she's sharing, which fear can lead to avoidance. If I avoid the person, if I avoid, now some avoidance is healthy, especially if the person or the situation is still dangerous. But when we avoid reminders of the trauma, or we avoid the ability to process it, and that's a big part of substances and addictions at large, is our brain is trying to make sense of it. This is a classic example of what happens with veterans, is then they come home and instead of processing what happened and why did it happen, they start to drink. They start to engage in risky behaviors, right? Driving, super fast cars and getting into trouble. And the avoidance doesn't allow for the brain to heal. Think about, here, I don't know if I have it here. Oh, you can think about children, right? I don't know if you can see these pictures clearly, but these are pictures of kids who are trying to hide. They're playing hide and go seek, and many times kids think that if they can't see you, then you can't see them. This is what we do when we avoid trauma. We think that if I just close my eyes and not think about the trauma, that it'll just magically go away. But remember, it was traumatic. We cannot just close our eyes. So what are the consequences of avoidance? And this is one reason why tomorrow I have a whole presentation on addictions. And it's not just substances. You'll be quite surprised when you come tomorrow of how many addictions there are that sometimes seem very normal or less spotlighted to some degree. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But just what are some of the consequences? From a behavior standpoint, many unhealthy behaviors, addictions, isolation is also a form of avoidance where people have experienced trauma, hurt by people, and so they pull away completely from people. Toxic relationships, self-harm, suicide, right? Thoughts, negative thoughts about the trauma itself, about yourself, about others, about the world, about God, about life. Emotions, chronic depression, chronic anxiety, guilt, shame, helplessness, hyperarousal. And again, because avoidance gets in the way of healing. So you can think about the example of a broken arm. When I was in 7th grade, I broke this wrist. And I was playing football, and I ran into a girl, and she ran into my wrist, and it looked like this. And if I never got help, what would happen to my wrist? It would stay like that. It would heal. but it would heal incorrectly. And let's say I said, oh, but I don't want to go to the doctor. It's going to be so painful. It's fine. It would heal. And what would happen? It'd stay like that. And eventually, you would have more and more pain, as well as the pain of trying to live life, right, like this. So if I left it like that and healed, what would eventually have to happen? I'd go to the doctor, and the doctor would have to re-break it. Now, is that painful? Extremely painful. I use this analogy for my clients who have had trauma. They avoided it. They never came in for healing. And then they're like, okay, I'm finally ready for therapy. And I'm saying, just so you know, therapy can be painful. We are going to have to re-break that in order to heal properly. And what's actually kind of cool, part of my story was I didn't avoid it. Even in that moment, we had someone there who's actually related to the Hildebrands, and Dr. Knudsen, at that moment, without medication, snapped it back into place. Extremely painful, but hard now, easier later. Easy now, I could just leave it like that. Harder later. But many times with instant gratification, we want easy now, but that means hard later. So when we are wounded, we have different options. Number one, we can have proper care, right? And we're talking about a physical wound, but we'll see how this applies to emotional wounds. We can treat the wound, whether it's cleaning it, disinfecting it, bandaging it, making sure it's set right in place, resulting in rapid and complete healing. This is what happens within the first month before we develop PTSD. Or we could be neglectful, right? We could not attend to it, think that somehow it's going to be better on its own, but that either results in slower healing or no healing at all, or even things like infection. Or some of us go the extra step of not just being neglectful, but actually being harmful, where we intentionally infect it, maybe rubbing dirt in the wound, right? Causing more infection, possibly a loss of a limb, and so forth. So if we're so prone to seeing a physical wound and going into taking care of it, then how much more do we also need to take care of our emotional wounds? Most of us grew up, though, with parents who said things like, suck it up, right? Or be a good girl or strong boy. And if you notice, regardless of what gender you are or what culture you came from, it's pervasive in all of them. Men have their issues because they've been told as men that they cannot be emotional, they cannot be weak. Women have that, but from the other perspective of being overly emotional and overly sensitive and dramatic. Both are ways to communicate not to attend to your emotions. You look at this across cultures, whether you're Hispanic or Asian, different cultures have the same idea of you can attend to your physical wounds, but not your emotional. When I worked in primary care settings, they had psychologists integrated into the primary care settings because many people won't go to therapy. And so they come to their doctor and they say, oh, doctor, I've been having this chest pain, right? We were talking last night about even in the ER coming and saying, oh, it's a heart attack and it's anxiety. But no way will I go to a therapist. I will go to a doctor. They have this understanding that for especially Asian groups, they tend to somaticize a lot of their emotional experience because they've been taught to not express any emotion. So it'll come out in their bodies. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mhm. So we can talk more about that a little bit. I'll answer to some degree, but it's a good question because children often don't have the ability to process things on their own. So how does this apply to a child? If you think about trauma, let's say if someone was physically abused as a child, the trauma itself is not just the physical abuse. The trauma happens before that. If they don't have a parent that's safe enough to either protect them or to be there when the physical abuse gets revealed, because attachment is where trauma happens. And so oftentimes when someone says, oh, this happened to me as a child and I told my mom or I told my teacher and they didn't believe me, that's actually the trauma. Because children who have actually told their parents and their parents were comforting and helped them process it, those children don't go on to have those same issues. So it's not just the bad things happening. That's a point to what I mentioned about the 9/11 attack. It's not just about bad things happening, but do I have a safe environment to process that? And with children, it's primarily their parents. So this is just a side note, but I see some parents here. Many times we're so afraid of bad things happening to our children. And that is scary. I'm pregnant. I'm, thinking about a future child. That's scary. But what you have to think about is not protecting them from every bad thing to happen, but how can I be so safe that if something bad does happen, they can tell me and we can process it together. Because we live in a bad world in which bad things will happen to your children. So you cannot prevent it. There's some things that are wise to do, but you want to make sure that you can help them process it. Now, if you didn't have that, God does give us opportunities later on to heal. And I like to say that he's in the business of redemption, right? Something that was lost can be found. So I love this quote. We can ignore reality, but we cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. And so we realize that many times we're avoiding trauma, we're ignoring the reality of trauma, and yet we experience a lot of consequences. So instead of processing the trauma, which would be healthy, expressing, releasing the emotions, that's the arousal part, and making sense of what happened, that's the cognitive part, that's the intrusions, and overall just making it a memory that our brain can put in a file cabinet right in our brains and be like, okay, that happened in chapter 2 of my experience. That leads to healing we avoid, and that leads us to long-term pain. So if avoidance gets in the way of processing and healing, what do we need to do? We need to remove the avoidance, which is tomorrow we'll talk about removing addictions, but also approach the trauma. And again, scary, painful, but necessary. So that's just revealing those wounds, revealing the trauma that we've experienced, and then how do we heal? So we remember this verse talking about the revealing part, search my heart, but then notice the ending, and lead me in the way everlasting. We cannot be in a better path without first searching our hearts. And so that's what we all want, right? The healing. We want to be in a better way of life, a way of everlasting. And so what steps do we take? So trauma recovery, there are multiple stages, and they are best summarized in these 3 stages: safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection. And in that order. So first, before we notice step number 3, before we reconnect, this is what my sister was saying in the back about, how do I trust? How do I reconnect? Well, if I try to reconnect with people I do not trust and I have a lot of fear, then I'm setting myself up potential for re-injury. So I first need to start with establishing a sense of safety in my life. safety, and then understanding and processing and mourning what had happened before we reconnect. Trauma is very similar to grief. So if you've ever gone through grief recovery, if you understand the grieving process, it's very similar to trauma, because trauma, something has happened to us that results in a loss. Whether it's a loss of a loved one or a loss of our own sense of safety, a loss of connection, a loss of a purity of life, whatever it may be, we must grieve. So stage number one, this one I'm going to go through very briefly, and I will reference back the audio resources that I gave in the beginning. This is where a lot of basic therapies tend to cover safety, right? How do you have healthier behaviors, healthier emotions, healthier thoughts? And this is why oftentimes people go to therapy and may feel like, wow, I didn't have the deep trauma healing that I needed. Because often it stays in stage one. That doesn't mean that it's not good, but you might be here saying, I've already gone through this. Let's move on. But some of you may not have. And so it's important to first seek stability and healthy coping in your life. This is decreasing unhealthy behaviors, right? If, let's say, this is just kind of an example of this. If you're not sleeping well, sleep goes in stage one. Please do not try to start processing the trauma, because sleep is important for consolidating memory. It's important for attention and concentration. And so if you've ever noticed you don't sleep well, the next day you wake up very irritable, very emotional, well, it's going to be harder to process your therapy. Not impossible, but harder if you don't sleep well. Now, you might have some chronic sleep issues, and maybe that's hard, but it's a combination of things. Sleep well, have healthy exercise, movement of your body. Try to maximize your body being in a state in which it can do hard work. Right? If you have to do physical hard labor tomorrow, but you woke up super tired, you didn't eat, you're nutrient deficient, right? All these things, it's going to be harder to do physical labor. Same thing with emotional labor. So try as much to establish stability. If you're engaging in extreme unhealthy behaviors that are actually life-threatening, that's also part of this. If you're coping in ways that are harmful to you, try to first seek more stability. Not perfection. You're not going to reach perfection because the trauma is still there, but more stability. Stage number two, this is where you start telling the story of the trauma, writing it down. We'll go through this. And I mentioned already about trauma and grief. And one therapy that's really helpful to address this stage is called cognitive processing therapy. It came out of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and so it uses very similar components. And for the next, I don't know how many slides, I'm going to go through CPT, cognitive processing therapy. This is the part that for some of you might be overwhelming, because basically what I'm doing is I'm giving you free therapy. I'm going through all the steps of that actual therapy, because some of you may not be able to access therapy. I saw a question on one of the cards about, is there someone who does what you do here in Marquette? I don't know, I'm not from here, but a lot of therapists are also not trained in trauma therapy, so that's hard, and I sympathize. Therefore, I'm going to give you some steps that you can do on your own. Hopefully, this is not too overwhelming, but helpful, and remember, if you need to process it later, you can. So cognitive processing therapy. Here are the three main categories of things that we do in processing therapy, and I'm going to go through each one. So the first one is called the impact statement. This is where someone comes in, and one of the first things we have them do is we ask them to write a one-page summary of why they think, I think I have this on the next one. Here we go. One-page document, why did the trauma or traumas happen? This is really important because it's trying to understand what meaning did we give it. So remember last night when I mentioned it's very common for people to self-blame. If they say, oh, it was my fault that my brother was hurting me. That's the why did it happen? Oh, it was my fault. I asked for it. That's an incorrect understanding. So imagine this. If I am to blame, then who really is the perpetrator? I am. Which means if I hold on to that meaning for the rest of my life, I'm walking around with myself. I'm the perpetrator. I'm the danger. And so we never heal from trauma because of this incorrect understanding of why it happened in the first place. So this page that we have them write is to understand what meaning have they given this trauma. How did the trauma impact me in these different areas? And these areas are the five main areas in which trauma attacks us. Intimacy both with myself and other people. How did it impact my sense of trust? That's huge with trauma, right? Trauma always happens in the context of relationships. So trust is always an issue. But also we often forget, and it's very common, of power and control. When bad things happen to us, it gives us a sense of powerlessness, of helplessness, especially if you were a child, because you actually were helpless as a child. You were powerless. But imagine if you carry that belief for the rest of your life. Many times clients come in and I tell them, okay, let's do this or let's do this. And they're like, I can't. It's too hard. And sometimes when you're not trained in this, you get frustrated with people. Why aren't you making the change that you know is good for you? Because sometimes they have a deep-rooted trauma belief. I'm powerless. I can't. There's no point. What's the point? So powerlessness and control, esteem. How do you esteem yourself and others? Self-esteem, that's a common thing we talk about. Low self-worth is an extremely common consequence of trauma. And then safety, your sense of safety in this world. If you're thinking that anything bad can happen to you any minute, right, you're walking around with constant arousal, hypervigilance. So when you write, through these different points, we end up coming out with these cognitions, these thoughts that are unhealthy, that remember, it's not about the trauma itself, it's the meaning that you give it that then impacts every other aspect of your life for the rest of your life until you change those thoughts. Here's a quotation from a manual that's helpful to understand how this comes to play. By the time child and adolescent trauma victims receive therapy as adults, they may have settled on cognitions or thoughts that were constructed at a time when their executive functions, right, their frontal lobe was not fully developed. This is probably the reason why so many clients with PTSD have extreme beliefs and have been traumatized repeatedly. CPT may well assist such clients in developing affect regulation, knowing how to manage their emotions, increasing their thought flexibility, so not being so rigid in their thinking, and changing many assumptions and beliefs that were developed at a period of thought immaturity. And notice this, that were never re-examined because of avoidance symptoms. So if I believe I'm to blame and I didn't go to a parent or I couldn't go to a parent to understand that, hey, buddy, no, you were not to blame. That person did something terrible. It's that person to blame. Or maybe you have this thought, I can't trust anybody because this person hurt me and this person was someone I trusted. Well, anybody, how are you going to live life if you believe I can't trust anybody? So here are some examples. Let me tell you about stuck points. So we call them stuck points. Thoughts that you have about the trauma or that came from trauma that keep you stuck from recovery. If I believe, and here's some examples, that I'm to blame, that I'm damaged forever, that one's very common, especially when there's been physical harm to you. I'm damaged forever. I must be on guard at all times. Other people should not be trusted. God is punishing me. Here are a few other ones. If I let other people get close to me, I'll get hurt again. I must control everything that happens to me. Expressing any emotion means I'll lose control of myself. The world is dangerous. I am powerless. these are some of the most common stuck points, thoughts that we have that keep us stuck from recovery. Another common one that just came to mind is often sometimes people are untrustworthy, but sometimes it's more specific of men are untrustworthy. And so if I believe that, I will forever have relational difficulties in ways that keep the trauma. You're basically reliving it every time you interact with a male, every time you interact with someone who reminds you of the trauma. So if those are the main issues, we're going to have to then address it. Before we address it, which is in step 3, we also have our clients write the trauma itself. So we're going to go through, what does it mean to write this trauma account? Why? Why is it important to write the trauma account? Not everyone needs to write the trauma account. Again, some people are able to talk about it, able to share it, and there's no difficulty. But for many people, they haven't processed what has happened. So the instructions for the trauma account is you write the details of the event. The more detailed, the better, including as many sensory details, sight, sound, smells, etc. And then the second account that we have them write is writing your thoughts and feelings that you had during the incident, as well as what was happening for you as you are writing. And then you read it daily to yourself. This is kind of a form of like exposure therapy. If you're afraid of something, think about anything in life. If you expose yourself over and over again, what eventually happens? You get used to it, right? I had a client, well, actually Linda, she's a great example, where she had to write about her multiple rapes. And eventually initially she was like, I can't do this. This is too hard. And so one key thing that if you are writing and it gets too strong, you can just put a line and come back to it later. And those lines are helpful because that tells you what parts of the story are most just triggering for you. But she got to a place where she's like, I'm just kind of bored. I'm bored of writing this. I'm bored of reading it, because it came to a place where it's a memory equal to any other memory. Think about other memories of your childhood or other memories of your adult life. They don't have the same emotional weight to it. And so it becomes a memory like others. So let's see here. Part of the purpose of the trauma account is to integrate the sensory details. So let me explain this. Trauma, also another reason why we're often triggered with trauma, is that trauma is stored in our brain as fragments. So sensory details, you might remember a smell, a sight. Let me give you an example. There was a woman who was driving in her car, and she went up and she picked up Krispy Kreme donuts. She put the Krispy Kreme donuts on her passenger seat. She kept on driving. And then she got into a life-threatening accident. She survived, but it was very traumatizing for her. Afterwards, she would go into a store and she would have this flood of anxiety, and she'd run out of the store. So what typically happens is people start avoiding stores. They start avoiding places that they're having this huge anxious response. Can anyone put the pieces together? Why was she having that huge anxious response? She would smell donuts. Her brain stored the trauma in fragments, and so all that her brain registered was smell equals danger. Now, are Krispy Kreme donuts dangerous? Well, in a different way. Not life-threatening, right? But her brain equated the two. Now, what was actually dangerous? The car accident. But it was paired in her mind. And so by writing an account, your brain starts integrating all these little pieces like a puzzle. And you start putting it together and you say, oh, I can go to the store, and over time I need to smell this over and over again to realize that's not what's dangerous. I need to instead understand what happened in the car accident. That's what's dangerous. And let's say if she starts writing the trauma account, she goes, oh, I was texting when I was driving. This didn't happen, but let's say that was the case. Oh, what's dangerous is texting, not the smell. And so part of it with the trauma account is putting it all together to make sense of what happened. I had a veteran who um, he had this, one of his triggers was peace and calm. And it's kind of really bizarre. Normally something it's more concrete. And it wasn't until he wrote out his trauma account that the story behind this trigger was he was in Iraq and it was late at night and he was off duty. And so he was there with his buddies in one of the, like a rooftop house, a rooftop of a house, and he was drinking tea and just relaxing. And then a house over where his other buddies were exploded and they all died. In his brain, he associated the calmness and the tea and just the peacefulness with this danger. And so what did he tell himself? Anyone want to guess what his stuck point was? Tea caused the explosion? Maybe. He didn't have directly, triggers with the tea. But when I'm not on guard, right, when I'm at peace and calm, bad things happen. So you believe that, and you believe it for the rest of your life, what's going to happen? I'm going to always be on guard. And this is what happens with veterans. Many times they'll sit in a restaurant, and they don't sit with their back to the door. They have to see every single exit, always being on guard. Why? Because they learned, and it's actually true. That belief is true in that context, but it's no longer true, right? You can sit in a restaurant and be safe. Unless you're in a particular dangerous neighborhood, then you might want to be aroused. So we're trying to integrate the sensory details. We're reducing arousal, the emotional experience, by eliminating avoidance. This is where this individual would, or this woman would go to the stores and expose herself to the smell. Process your feelings and your thoughts. Why did this happen? Why do I feel this way? Before working on changing the narrative. And again, like grief work, we need to express those emotions. So many times we've never mourned the loss, in this case of the veteran, he never mourned the loss of his friends. Instead, he was so focused on blaming himself and that he should have done something. And then he came back and he was heavily drinking and doing all these other things. He ended up getting a divorce because of his erratic behavior. And then it gets messier and messier. And as more time passes, you're more and more distant away from the situation, and so you don't make sense. Another good examples, I had another veteran who also blamed himself. He was in a bar, this is a Vietnam vet, and he was having a good time, and there were some of his other buddies there. He was in the Army, they were in the Marines, and he saw this young boy run up to the bar right outside, leave a bicycle, and run off. And his brain immediately was like, bomb. He ran out of there quickly, and the bar exploded, and everyone died in the bar. He went on to blame himself. I didn't warn anyone. It was my fault, which notice the deceptions with trauma. It's so sad because on the outside, we're able to say, of course that wasn't your fault, but when you're in it, there's confusion. So we had to write out every single detail, and this individual is very stubborn. He's like, it is my fault. Nothing you tell me is going to tell me it wasn't my fault. But we had to go down to the seconds. And he realized this happened in 3 seconds. He realized, I saw it, and I just ran. Then he started to say, well, I really didn't like those Marines. I wanted them dead. So then his feelings then were confusing. And so I said, okay, well, did you think in that 3 seconds about those Marines? And as he was writing the details and things were coming back, he said, all I remember is seeing the face of my wife and thinking I needed to be saved for her. And so finally, after writing the details of the trauma, did he realize the truth was he was not to blame. It wasn't even really the child, it's whoever used the child, right? And he was able to mourn the loss of those individuals, as well as recognize he was not to blame and he could relieve that burden forever. So the power of the trauma account. There's a biblical story that tells us the importance of telling our stories. It's the hemorrhaging woman, found in multiple accounts. I really like Mark 5 and his account, but I don't have time to go into the details. But it's really fascinating that this woman, she's dealing with an infirmity for 12 years. And she goes, she touches the hem of Jesus, and what happens? It says her blood, which was dried up immediately, okay? Now, if you continue to read the story, what's fascinating is that Jesus stops her, talks with her, and then he says, go, your faith has made you well. You have been healed. But you might ask, if she already had her blood dried up, why is Jesus now saying she's healed? When you look at the context, there are differences in the word healing. Her blood was dried up, meaning she was physically healed, but it wasn't until her conversation with Jesus until she was desozo, the original word is desozo healing, meaning complete. So you ask, what in the encounter with Jesus led to complete healing? And Luke adds a little detail. It says that she shared her story in the presence of all. Sharing her story was critical. And one of the reasons why was at that time, if you had that kind of illness, you would have been ostracized from the community. Jesus knew that she needed to share her story in order to be reunited with the community. Because she could have been healed physically and gone away, but would that really have changed her life completely? Storytelling is incredibly important for your healing. And I love this quote. It says, shame dies when stories are told in safe places. And that's a part of her story. It doesn't say explicitly, but with all that she had gone through, being a woman, having an infirmity of bleeding, constant bleeding, being financially in debt because she gave everything to the doctors, all of that would have been extremely shameful for her. And Jesus wanted to heal her completely by also restoring her to the community. Key word here, though, safe. You cannot share your story in unsafe places, which, as my sister shared earlier, can we make church to be a safe place of healing for people? So the last bit is the ABC sheets, which is basically then taking those stuck points and challenging them to find a better meaning. The greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves. And this is very fascinating because this book, I agree with a lot of it, but some of it, and just in general trauma treatment, it has a lot of different ways to find healing. And sometimes it emphasizes a lot about like your body and other things which are a component of healing. But if the greatest sources of our suffering are lies, can you heal if you don't address the lies? No. And you see this principle throughout the Bible, the importance of having healthy thinking. So what we do is we take these sheets, this is what it looks like, and we start making sure both with the trauma but also with general things that we're having healthy thinking, not positive thinking, truthful thinking. If you've messed up and you're like, I'm a terrible person, is that true? No. Terrible, no. But you're not going to say, I'm fine, no worries. No, I have messed up. Because if you think no worries, maybe whatever you've done, you're not making remedy for that. So we want truthful thinking, not positive thinking. Then after people get used to challenging their thoughts, the sheet becomes more complicated and expands. But basically, we would take some of these step points and we would challenge them. Are you really to blame for the abuse? Are people at large really untrustworthy? And this is where you might break down, actually this person did this to me. Okay, what were the qualities of that person that demonstrate they're unsafe? Because many times we don't actually know how to really identify safe versus unsafe people when we've experienced trauma. It's all confused. And so we're like, I don't know, so let me just isolate completely. No, I need to learn. And one of the books here, Changes That Heal, and then he also has another book, Dr. Henry Cloud, Safe People, how to identify safe people. And I think that's also one of the questions is in order to heal, you need to be able to say, okay, it's not that people altogether are untrustworthy. Some people, sometimes with some things, So we need to have discernment. When we say God is punishing me, is that really true? What does the Bible say about his character? And don't take what people, Christians, tell you about his character. What does he say about himself? Am I really powerless? And I love this principle found in God's word. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That is so true for therapy. But if I don't have the truth, right, if lies are the greatest source of our suffering, then I'm going to not heal. Two other main components for healing is empowerment and connection. And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. But empowerment is really important because, again, a big part of trauma makes us feel powerless. There was a study that was done, well, multiple studies, of rats and dogs, and so I'm going to quickly review some of these, where rats are hung by their tail, and basically they're trying to get up, and what they term this is learned helplessness. Over time, the rat just gives up, right? Because it learns there's nothing I can do. But later on, they did another study, which I'll come to in a moment, but they have also done this with dogs, where they have put dogs on this was before some animal ethics came out, where they put dogs on a shock pad. And there's nothing they could do. They just get shocked over and over and over again. And what did they learn? They learned helplessness. There's nothing I can do. So let's parallel that to trauma. Let's say you're a child where bad things are happening to you constantly. You learn, I can't run away. And most kids don't ever think about running away because they're completely dependent on their parents for survival. Right? It doesn't make sense for a child to run away. So this dog is sitting on the shock pad. And then they took those dogs, you can see this apparatus here, where they could, now there's a shock pad, but there's also a place where you could go where there isn't shocks. And part of that, there's another study that you could press a lever to stop the shocks. The dogs who have never been shocked before would easily jump to the other side, and they're fine. But what do you think happened to the dogs that were shocked over and over and over again when they were finally transferred to this apparatus? They stayed. There was a possibility of not being shocked, or they could have pressed a lever, and they never did. They'd even try. They just stayed there. There's a video of a bear who was in a cage for many, many years, and you can YouTube it, bear in cage for many years, and you'll see the bear now released into the forest, just walking in circles as if they're still in that cage. 7 years later, still walking in circles. Because we learned, oh, I'm trapped. And that bear thought, living now in an invisible cage. What happens with the rats, this one's a fascinating study, is that another rat study that they did was they put them in a pool of water and had them swim. On average, they'd give up, sink, and drown after 15 minutes. Keep trying, and eventually after 15 minutes, they'd give up. Now, another group of rats is before they would drown, before they'd give up, they would pluck them out of the water, aka giving them hope. Something can change. And then they'd put them back in. For these rats, how long do you think that they were how long did they last? So the first one was 15 minutes. How long do you think they last with the mentality that they could be saved? 2 hours. Anyone else want to have a guess? 10 seconds? So generally, you would think that it'd be longer because they have this hope that at any moment now, someone's going to rescue me. So we just keep on swimming. Anyone else? A minute? They didn't give up. Ever? Ever. They lasted 60 hours. So compare 15 minutes with a mentality of, no one's coming for me, I'm just going to give up, versus 60 hours. This is the importance of empowerment, when we actually believe I can do something. But trauma robs us of that belief, thinking that I'm powerless. So that's why a big component of trauma treatment is empowering patients to believe that they can, including changing their own narrative. To live is to suffer. To survive, or I like to say thrive, is to find some meaning in the suffering. So this is another component. It's not just about then exposing yourself to the story. The other component is then making meaning of your story. This is what researchers term post-traumatic growth, where not only do you learn to survive and cope with the trauma, but you can get to a place where you have now made meaning of that trauma, and now that you've grown more than if you didn't experience that trauma. Here's the term post-traumatic growth. Think about a butterfly, right? A butterfly goes through trauma before it comes out as a butterfly. If you study the details of metamorphosis, even before they come out, they have to fight their way out of the cocoon, including causing injury to their very own wings. But what's fascinating is as they do that, their wings are getting strong enough to actually fly when they come out. The power of trauma, but in a way that leads to more transformation. So post-traumatic growth refers to the positive changes that can occur after experiencing a traumatic event. It's the process of transformation in which individuals emerge from a crisis with a deeper understanding of themselves, their relationships, their world, resulting in enhanced resilience, well-being, and personal growth. Which, if you think about it, we all experience the trauma of living on Earth. And so we all have this opportunity to, right, they say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Now, I do know that some of you are at the place where you're not here yet, and that's okay. You might take these other steps, but it is a journey. This is I don't know if it's a poem or just a story that was written, I found online, that speaks about how we can transform our stories and the importance of not avoiding difficulties, but seeing maybe even the good in the difficulties. And it's called My Ways, God's Ways. It talks about different biblical stories. I would have pulled Joseph out of that pit, out of that prison, out of that pain. And I would have cheated nations out of the one God would use to deliver them from famine. I would have pulled David out of Saul's spear-throwing presence, out of the caves he hid away in, out of the pain of rejection. And I would have cheated Israel out of a God-hearted king. I would have pulled Esther out of being snatched from her only family, out of being placed in a position she never asked for, out of the path of a vicious, power-hungry foe. And I would have cheated a people out of the woman God would use to save their very lives. And I would have pulled Jesus off of that cross, off of the road that led to suffering and pain, off of the path that would mean nakedness and beatings, nails and thorns. And I would have cheated the entire world out of a Savior, out of salvation, out of an eternity filled with no more suffering and no more pain. And oh friend, I want to pull you out. I want to change your path. I want to stop your pain. But right now, I know I would be wrong. I would be out of line. I would be cheating you and cheating the world out of so much good. Because God knows, He knows the good this pain will produce. He knows the beauty this hard will grow. He's watching over you and keeping you even in the midst of this. And He's promising you that you can trust Him, even when it all feels like more than you can bear. So instead of trying to pull you out, I'm lifting you up. I'm kneeling before the Father and I'm asking Him to give you strength, to give you hope. I'm asking Him to protect you and to move you when the time is right. I'm asking Him to help you stay prayerful and discerning. I'm asking Him how I can best love you and be a help to you. And I'm believing He's going to use your life in powerful and beautiful ways, ways that will leave your heart grateful and humbly thankful for this road you've been on. It's the power reflecting on all good leaders, all good, powerful individuals have gone through terrible experiences, and many times in ways that have shaped them. I have told my patients, without the experiences you have gone through, you have become an empathic person. You've become a person who cares for other people in ways that Who knows what your life would have looked like without it? Now, that doesn't mean that the trauma itself was good. It's that good can come out of it, and it's a choice that we make. And I love that that's highlighted in the story of Jesus. The cross was a symbol of torture, excruciating pain, and death until Christ died and it became a symbol of life. This is one of the most powerful examples, even if individuals don't believe in him as a savior, even as a historical figure, the fact that you could change the complete meaning of a symbol of death to life is incredible. What does God want to do with your story of trauma? And the last bit, which is extremely important, is the importance of connection. And I don't have time to go into it, so you can review some of these things on the slides later. But I do want to highlight a couple of quotes, and then I'll end with a story. This is another great book on trauma. It's a notebook of a child psychiatrist who deals with childhood trauma victims. I encourage you that if you've experienced your own traumas and are still triggered, not to read this book, because it goes through chapter by chapter different traumas. But he says this: the most traumatic aspects of all disasters involve the shattering of human connections. And this is especially true from children, being harmed by the people who are supposed to love you, being abandoned by them, being robbed of the one-on-one relationships that allow you to feel safe and valued, to become humane. These are profoundly destructive experiences because humans are inescapably social beings. The worst catastrophes that can befall us inevitably involve relational loss. As a result, recovery from trauma and neglect is also all about relationships, rebuilding trust, regaining confidence, returning to a sense of security, and reconnecting to love. Of course, medications can relieve symptoms, and talking to a therapist can be incredibly useful, but healing and recovery are impossible, even with the best medications and therapy in the world, without lasting, caring relationships with others. If trauma happens in relationships, both a rupturing of our relationships with others, our horizontal relationships, and our vertical relationship with God, we must restore both. That's why one of the books here is on forgiveness, because forgiveness is essential. It's not optional, it's necessary for healing with trauma. And also just learning how to be safe. So forgiveness and boundaries. Because some people forgive, but then they open themselves up to everyone, and that's not healthy as well. But with reconnecting with God, one of the motivators behind the work that I do is the story of my father. So the little one, the one that looks grumpy, is me. My father grew up in Brazil, and at only a couple of weeks old, he was taken by his mother and abandoned at the doorstep of his aunt. So already trauma number one, abandoned by his mother. His father didn't even know of his existence, but abandoned by his mother, never knew his father. His aunt had her own children and was surviving to just provide for her own children. And so there were constant other abuses of mistreating him, treating him like Cinderella. And eventually, she was fed up, "You're not my child," and she sent him to an orphanage. Now, this is where there's a gap in my father's story, primarily because I don't think he would ever want to share the details of the traumas that happen in orphanages. Not just probably by your caretakers, but by other orphans at different ages. I can probably fill in the gaps based off of other people's experiences, but just so many traumas. And not only that, but then being funneled from orphanage to orphanage till about the age of 16, when he was out on the streets of Brazil on his own. And some of you may know about some parts of Brazil, but also during those days, not very developed, he does share stories about his poverty, trying to find food, going without food for many. So just, if you think about it, trauma at every stage, right? Relationally, rejection, neglect, physical abuse, and so forth. And my father, his story is very fascinating because one day I was sitting in one of my graduate classes, and my professor was sharing from a very pessimistic view that when people experience this kind of trauma, they're forever wounded and there's no cure, right? There's no remedy. And she went on to say, not only do they have all this dysfunction, but they end up being poor in relationships. And I went up to her and I shared my story with my father. I have a very loving father, wonderful relationship. And she asked me, well, how? Right? Like, someone with his story cannot have the outcome of his life. He's a professional, he's well established, financially stable, has a loving family. What explains the outcome? When my father, after the age of 16, he was quite mischievous, someone came up to him and handed him a Bible. And when he was reading the Bible, this verse stood out to him. Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has born? Which is a question that you would assume, of course not. And the other versions say, forget her suckling child. So there's this imagery of the baby being on her very breast. Can a mother forget the baby that's on her very breast? You would think no, but the answer is yes, it happens. Though she may forget you, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. This is Jesus who says, look how much I love you. This, my father always shares, was extremely healing. He said, in that moment, I understood who I was. I understood that I was loved and I was cherished, that every human being could fail me, but God is my heavenly Father. So he took this and he said, okay, I have my establishment now in God. And from that point forward, God directed him to other paths of then having healing relationship with my mother, right? Not a perfect parent, but healing as he experienced the love of God that outflowed into healing relationships also with people. To be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. To be known and not loved is our greatest fear. But to be fully known and truly loved is, well, a lot like being loved by God. That's what we want, to be fully known and truly loved. It is what we need more than anything. That's at the root of trauma. It liberates us from pretense, humbles us out of our self-righteousness, and fortifies us for any difficulty life can throw at us. And so I want to end with that, the power of connection, both with God, but with one another, and what are the steps that we can take to ensure that we are able to be restored in that way. And then tomorrow we'll be talking about addiction, because that's often what gets in the way both of healing but also of having those restored relationships. Thank you.